Welcome back to Dark Academia Queen. This is part two of the Georgian Era. Um, since it was so long, I thought I'm gonna split this up. But if you're new here, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that bell for notifications. Also, for any updates on my channel or podcast, you can find me on Twitter or Facebook. I do have three sister podcasts, True Crime Lounge, Just a Breezy Chat, and Sassy Southern Belle. If you would like to go check those out, you can also go check out my previous episodes as well. I do know I can promise you that once we get done with the Georgian era, we are going to jump into my one area of literature where Edgar Allan Poe was dubbed the father of. Can you guess which one? If not, you'll have to find out next episode. Um, but let's talk about the Enlightenment, shall we? Um, Historians have long explored the importance of the Scottish Enlightenment, as well as the American Enlightenment, and have debated on the very existence of the English Enlightenment. So, the English historian Peter Gay argues that the Scottish Enlightenment was a small and cohesive group of friends who knew who knew one another intimately and talked about another necessity. Education was a priority in Scotland, but at the same time, and especially in four universities, the Enlightenment culture was based off the close readings, new books, and intense discussions that took place daily with intellectual gatherings placed at Edinburgh, the Select Society, and later the Poker Club, as well within Scotland's ancient universities, sharing the humanist and rationalist outlook in the European Enlightenment of the same time. The thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment asserted the importance of human reason combined with their rejection of authority could be justified by reason. In Scotland, the Enlightenment was characterized by thoroughgoings of empiricalism and practicality, where the chief values were improvement, virtue, and practical benefit, and to the individual and society as a whole. Among the fields that rapidly advanced were philosophy, economics, history, architecture, and medicine. Leaders would include Francis Hutcheson, David Hume, Adam Smith, Dugald Stewart, Thomas Reed, William Robinson. I wonder if he's related to really Robinson by chance. Um, Henry Home, Lord Keynes, Adam Ferguson, John Playfair, um, Joseph Black, and James Hutton. Now let's talk about the English Enlightenment, shall we? Um, the very existence of the English Enlightenment has been debated by scholars, and the majority of textbooks and standard surveys make no room for the English Enlightenment. So some European surveys include England, others ignore it and do not coverage on such major intellects as Addison, Edward Gibbon, John Locke, Isaac Newton, Alexander Pope, and Joshua Reynolds. And we know why. And John Locke, I think, is probably the most known, especially with American history, as if you know anything about how our Constitution and all of that, yes. And according to Derek Hurst, in the 1640s and 50s, saw a revived economy characterized by growth in the manufacturing and elaboration of financial and credit instruments, and the commercialization of communication. The gentry found that time for leisure activities such as horse racing and blowing, and in high culture, important innovations included the development of the mass market for music, increased scientific research, and expansion of publishing. All the trends were discussed in depth in newly established coffee house. Now, Ray Porter argues that the reasons for this neglect and the assumption of the movement were primarily French inspired and and it was largely a-religious and anti-clerical as it stood outspoken in defiance of the established order. Porter admits that after the 1720s, England could claim thinkers that equal Diderot, Voltaire, and Rossi. Indeed, its leading intellectuals such as Gibbon, Burke, and Johnson were all quite conservative and supported the standing order. Porter says that the reason was the Enlightenment came early to England and had succeeded, so that the culture had accepted the political liberalism, philos- philosophical empiricalism, and religious toleration, and that the sort of intellectual on the continent to fight for against the odds. The coffee house culture provided an ideal venue for enlightenment conversation. Furthermore, England rejected the collectivism on the continent and emphasized the importance of individuals as the main goal of the Enlightenment. The British sponsored numerous scientists as who made discoveries in the small laboratories. Joseph Priestley investigated electricity. Chemist Henry Cavendish identified the hydrogen in 1772. Daniel Waterford isolated nitrogen in 1774, and Priestley discovered oxygen and ammonia. Antiquarians and archaeologists mapped the past. In medicine, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu introduced inoculation against smallpox to Britain by 1740, and it would later in its wide usage. Guy's Hospital was founded in 1721, and the Royal Infirmary of in Edinburgh in 1729. Queen Charlotte's Maternity Hospital in 1739, and the Middlesex Hospital in 1745. Asylums for the mentally ill were also established, notably the Bethel Hospital in Norwich, uh, which was which was a ward for the incurable lunatics at Guy's Hospital, a lunatic hospital at Manchester, in York, and York would be, and it's also important to note that York would be the first to be called an asylum. Now, what ended the Georgian era? Well, historians debate the exact ending. It could be the death of George IV or William IV at the usual marker. In most social and cultural cultures, the time varied. The emergence of Romanticism in literature began as early as the 1700s, but religious change took place so took place much longer and were incomplete until a century later. The 1830s saw a development in the emergence of the Oxford movement in religion and the demise of classical architecture. Victorians typically were disapproving of the times of the previous era. And by the 19th century, the Georgian era were byword for the degenerate culture. Charles Abbey in 1878 argued the Church of England partake in the general sordidness of the age. Now, let's talk about the timeline, shall we? In 1714, upon the death of second cousin Queen Anne, George Louis, Elector of Hanover, became George I. Um, in 1715, the Whig Party will win the British Parliament. 1727, George IV died, and George II becomes king. Um, in 1745, the final Jacobite rising is crushed at the Battle of Culloden in April 1746. 1746, 1760, George II dies, and George III takes the crown. 1763, British is victorious in the Seven Years' War. The Treaty of Paris of 1763 grants them domain over vast new territories in the world. 1765, the Stamp Act is passed. 1769 to 70, Australia and New Zealand are claimed by British colonies. 1773, the Enclosure Act is placed by British Parliament. 1775, the American Revolution. 1776, the American colonies declared their independence. 1777, the main British invasion surrenders at Saratoga, and the French increased their aid to the Americans. 1778, France forms a military alliance with the U.S., declaring war on Britain. 1781, the British Army in America under Lord Cornwallis surrenders at George Washington after its defeat at Yorktown, Virginia. 1782, the Battle of Saints. 1783, Britain finally recognizes the independence of the 13 colonies. 1788, Australia is settled through penal transportation to the colony in South Wales on January 26. 1789, Thomas Robert Matris, author of the Essay of Principles of Population. 1801, the Act of the Union in 1800. 1807, the abolition of the Slave Trade Act became law. 1811, George IV becomes regent. 1815, Napoleon I of France is defeated by the Seven Coalition in the Duke of Wellington. 1819, the Peterloo Massacre occurs. 1820, the George III dies. 1830, George IV dies. 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act passes Parliament with the influence of William Wilberforce. 1837 is the transition to the Victorian Era, where King William IV dies. Let's note, all the monarchs in the Georgian Era, George I through the Fourth, and William IV. Alright, that is it, and join me as we talk about dark romanticism next episode.